PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. Here's my pick of the games from round 8 of the Tata Steel Masters. 20-year-old Vincent Keymer from Germany against 32-year-old Fabiano Caruana from the USA. Of course, he is one of the leading players in the world in classical chess and has been for years now. Remember, he played against Magnus Carlsen for the world title in 2018. And Keymer, well, he's one of the new generation battling his way to the top. Caruana struggling a bit in the tournament. Both players having not the best tournament so far. Caruana only on 50% going into this game, and Keymer, I think, I'm on -1 basically. So yeah, not having an easy time, both of them. It's a tough tournament. Anyway, let's look at this game because it's an extraordinary game actually. I mean, I've looked at some complex games so far in the tournament, and this actually I think is the most complex. So normal starts, a Queen's Gambit, an exchange variation. So this fixed pawn structure. I've always quite liked playing this as black, but you get strong adherence for both sides. And Caruana plays in the normal way, so the knight coming out quickly. And you could say the normal move here is to castle or throw in h6 first. But he goes with knight f8. So it's a little bit unusual, but this knight basically just wants to swing round here. Queen c2 and knight e6, so gains a little bit of time against the bishop. Now white doesn't want to give up that bishop, and this isn't very good for white. White gets 3 pawns for the piece, but basically black is very comfortable there. It isn't possible for another piece to join the queen. So basically black is fine. So the bishop comes back. And now black can't castle because then white will take and take with check. So therefore g6 blocks out this bishop. Move order is quite subtle here. White could just castle, but rook d1 played. Can be a useful move later on. If white wants to push with f3 and e4, this pawn will need protection. And castles from Caruana and castles. Okay, so we've got a very normal position here. Very often the idea of putting the knight on e6 and playing g6 is to play the knight back to g7. And then to play bishop f5 to exchange off this bishop. And that is possible, but white can play f3 and go for e4 quite quickly. Now that maneuver might take place later on, but Caruana plays a very flexible move here. He goes for a5. So it's funny sort of playing on both sides of the board. This can be a useful move later on, gaining space, but actually very often in connection with advancing the b pawn and then pushing on again. But it's basically a flexible move. I mean, there are so many moves for black in this position. Rook e8 looks very sensible. That's basically where the rook belongs in this kind of position. You could even go b5 straight away, but yeah, a5, very flexible move. Basically, Caruana is waiting to see how Keymer commits. And if f3, I mean, this is really what white wants to do, wants to push forward with e4. This Botvinnik developed this system, and Kasparov was a great adherent. Then b5. And it's actually very difficult for white to advance. So, for example, e4 and b4 and this pawn drops. So you see, that's one of the reasons why this knight is left on e6. So Keymer had quite a think here and played knight c1. And then knight g7. So kind of the pressure is off for the moment. Very long think from Caruana. I mean, this is such a tricky position. I think both sides have so many different options in all these positions, and there's no real calculation involved. You're just trying to figure out, you know, what your opponent's plan is, and there are lots of different plans. So bishop e6 played by Caruana. Again, e4 isn't possible because after this, queen takes d4 is check. So now Keymer brought the knight back. I mean, that looks a bit surprising to me. I think I would prefer to put the knight on b3, potentially, you know, looking at that square. So yeah, it looks funny to go back again, and you feel that black should be all right in this position. Rook c8, that's a subtle move. Very often with the rook opposite the queen, tactically that can be annoying for the queen, basically. So yeah, again, another subtle move. And king h1. I think if white is going to go for e4, then it's important to step away from this diagonal because things start to open up. Knight d7. Yeah, in principle, black wants to exchange these bishops. That will give black more freedom. So, for example, I mean, this didn't happen, but if bishop takes and e4, that's what white wants. You want to sort of push on the king side. Black can meet this by exchanging and playing f5, and that breaks up these pawns straight away. Black can be reasonably happy in that position. You know, if e5, then the bishop drops back, and you can see that, you know, black has a nice square for this knight. And there could be potential to break things up with c5 and get to this pawn. You've got to be a little bit careful about that one. But anyway, that's once these pawns have sort of split, then, you know, black has greater control, basically. So instead, the bishop dropped back to f2. That's pretty normal, and that lends some support to the d4 pawn, so it might be easier to play the pawn forward to e4. And Caruana advances on the queen side, so this is pretty normal. Can be nice to push away this knight. Knight f4. Okay, that looks at this one. Now instead of b4, knight b6. So that covers the a4 square if black wants to play b4. And finally e4 comes in. And bishop g5 played, hitting the knight. It looks tempting to exchange off the bishop, but black is pretty solid there. So bishop e3 played. I mean, that looks slightly awkward to me because, you know, there's potentially a bit of a pin. Caruana exchanges, and this is the crunch moment. Is that center weak or strong? Now, I mean, the move though that one would look at here is f5 to break up those pawns. In this case, that's really not good. Once that light squared bishop goes, nasty pin, f5 is hanging. I know that bishop is hanging, but basically this could be pretty unpleasant for black. So that's why Caruana played bishop g4, attacking a rook. And it feels most natural to put the rook on e1 in this position. And then knight e6. You know, if black can exchange some pieces, normally that will help. But, you know, it's an extremely double-edged position. But knight e2 played. That looks a bit weird to me. You know, self-pinning. And it gives black the chance to play f5. Now this, as I've mentioned before, strategically it's a good idea to break up those 2 pawns in the middle. Just gives black greater control over d5, for example. Knight takes f5. Already, this is so complicated. There are so many tactics. You know, having had that sort of maneuvering phase over the first 20 moves, position has now exploded, and it is just tactical. So, for example, black would have to look at knight e6. Is this any good? In fact, this is all right for black after this one. But queen b3 check. It's tricky. If king h8, then in this case, knight e6 is a strong move. So Caruana played knight c4, giving up a pawn. In this case, if knight e6, then queen e7 is actually okay for black, because this one is hanging. Bishop takes, queen takes, that's tricky. So Keymer took the pawn. Check. And rook f7 played. So another self-pin. Not ideal, but it seems to be okay for black. Here Keymer blundered. He played bishop c1. We'll look at that in a second. Knight e6 was correct. I mean, the tactics here are mad. And this could lead to mass exchanges after this. Knight takes queen. Knight takes queen, knight takes... So this is just a massacre, really. But it ends up in an equal endgame. Level material. But Keymer clearly wanted more. And, I mean, I think it's understandable. You know, he's a pawn up. This pin looks a little bit unpleasant. You know, the king isn't completely safe. So, okay. It's black to move. How would you play as black in this position? So, time for you to have a think. Time for me to have a drink. Black to play. What's the best move now? Cheers. Well, Caruana did not play the best move. He played queen e7, which is decent. But in fact, knight d6 wins material. Now, this is not, it's not obvious how and why, but let me take you through it. So, okay, what happens if the queen remains on this diagonal? That looks natural. Then this exchange. So a recapture. Now, got to be careful here. But first of all, this one, a4 nudges the queen off this diagonal, and then queen f8. This is not at all obvious. And basically white is caught in these pins, and it's too much. If g3, g5 just pushes the bishop, or if rook g1, take here, and then take on f4. Okay, what about alternatives? What about queen c2? Once again, queen f8 is the move. This is the key idea, pinning. And if g3, then takes here. Another exchange. And rook e8. And this is just too much for white. If rook d2, knight e4. Rook is attacked, and if it moves to d1 or d3, then knight f2. Fantastically complicated, and there are other variations there after knight d6 that need to be calculated. Not easy to spot, and particularly when you're under pressure with the clock as well. So Caruana played queen e7, which looks very natural. Just putting more pressure on e2. So rook e1 and bishop h4. He'd probably seen this and thought this was annoying for white. It is annoying because white doesn't really want to play g3 because that weakens the king. So knight g3 played, hitting the queen, and queen b4. And at this moment, with this attacked, Keymer exchanged and exchanged on f5. And so they've reached an endgame, but also very complex. Keymer is a pawn up, so he must have been relieved to reach some kind of stability with an extra pawn. But it's tricky. So the rook is attacked. What do you do about it? If rook d1, then bishop g4, and you certainly don't want to move up the board because there's the pin. What do you play here? Very, very tricky position. So he played g3, and the bishop came back to f6. But this is not a pleasant move because it weakens the king, and that bishop, the light squared bishop, doesn't have an opponent. So Caruana has excellent compensation for the pawn. d5 played. And very good move, bishop d7. So that bishop looking to get onto the long diagonal. Knight d3. Pawn takes and knight takes pawn. Keymer still a pawn up. Bishop b5 played. This is move 35, so players running short of time. Bishop h3 is indicated by my computer, and it certainly looks like a decent move. Gets very tricky now because white doesn't want to split those rooks. Something like this. Weird tactics, and both pieces are attacked. And if rook f3, the bishop comes back to f5, so that's threatened. And knight takes, you can take here. That one loses to bishop e4, and if knight f6, then bishop e4. So looks like bishop h3 is very difficult for white. I mean, it's possible, for example, in some positions you can give up material like this. Can white hold that position? That might be white's best chance, and that's not so easy to win. I mean, particularly with these split pawns. But who knows? So bishop h3 anyway looked like a decent prospect, but bishop e5 also very, very dangerous. And here is where Keymer makes a mistake. But honestly, finding the correct path through these complications is practically impossible. Keymer played rook f4. So these rooks are split. This is a problem. But if... Well, rook f2, let me just show you. Rook f2. This, incredibly, is okay for white. But you wouldn't think so after rook e7. So if rook takes rook, rook takes bishop, check. So that Zwischenzug or Zwischenschach wins material. So the rook moves to the side. Now watch this, bishop e2. I mean, this looks hopeless for white. So if the rook comes to g1, then there's bishop d4. The rook comes to e1, bishop f3, check, and you win this. Amazingly, white holds with this move. And this is ludicrous. Rook takes bishop, check. You take a piece with check. But because both these bishops are attacked, white holds. Finding that kind of continuation is impossible. You know, that move, rook d2, is ludicrous. You know, in your calculations, you're not going to continue when you can see that your opponent can take a piece with check. So anyway, rook, even if you got to that position, rook f4 played, rook e7, so it's the same as before. If rook takes rook, then rook takes bishop check. And bishop d2 played by Keymer. Yeah, rook d1 apparently a better move. And this knight d5 takes, and well, I mean, you know, who knows what's going on here. Rook f7, there's a difficult endgame basically. Can white hold this one? Not sure. I don't know. Feels unlikely somehow, but anyway. Bishop d2 played instead. And now this is very, very good for Caruana. The problem is that, yeah, rook f2, rook c1, and the bishop is dropping. So Keymer played bishop c3, and Caruana took the exchange. Without a rook for white, these minor pieces struggle. Keymer has these two pawns on the outside, but they can't get very far. And technically this is winning. King f7. Of course, knight takes pawn would be met by bishop c6. There we go. That's the weakness on the light squares. And I have to say, Caruana's technique was excellent here. So this bishop can hold the pawns, and now the rook always threatens to invade. Rook e4. f5 takes. And the king steps up. Yeah, if knight takes, then the rook reaches the second rank, and that really is hopeless. So the king had to step forward. And as I said, Caruana's technique was superb. Rook played here to defend the pawn, and basically that just cuts white's king. So the king simply can't reach the center or the queen side. And Caruana brings the king over to make sure that those pawns are going nowhere. Rook f1, so the rook makes room for that pawn and also starts to activate. And white is almost in a kind of zugzwang here. The bishop needs to remain on c3. The king can't move anywhere sensible. So knight f3. So the pawn moves have run out. Yeah, once b4 happens, I mean, this is kind of a double-edged sword, because yeah, it's the only source of counterplay for white. But the problem is, once the b pawn advances, then this bishop doesn't have support. f4. Bishop c4, nice and solid. And yeah, let's see what happens if b5. This is obviously critical. It's white's only chance, but rook c1. This bishop can just be hassled. And it's going to be lost. Yeah, bishop b2 and rook a2. It's gone. So that's the problem with advancing this. And this is game continuation. You can see that Caruana is just doing this. So Keymer wants to make room for the bishop to come to d4. But this is not that I think in the long term would help anyway. But d4 is a really incisive winning idea. If bishop takes, then bishop d5. Hitting the bishop and threatening rook d3. So those light squares again that are the problem. And if knight takes d4, rook d3. And again that bishop is doomed. Bishop b2, rook a2. So bishop b2 played. And again this pin really nasty. And now there are two pawns rolling down the board. And then Caruana simplifies just to finish. So rook here threatened. So king e2 and a nice little tactic at the end, f3, and Keymer resigned. So if king takes rook, f2, and one of those pawns is going through, because if king here, yeah, you make a queen, and the other one goes through. There we go. Wow, what a game. I mean, it was complex right from the opening, where, you know, there were very few pieces exchanged, and that middle game was just treacherous. But Caruana found his way through. I mean, he is an absolute class act. Well, he needed that. Let's just go to the standings. So after 8 rounds, Caruana has 4.5. He's made it over the 50% mark, 4.5. But there are still 3 leaders. It's the young lot, Gukesh, Abdusatorov and Pragyanananda, all on 5.5. But Caruana only a point behind and still 5 games to go. See you soon.